Hello and welcome to PerchPeek Pods, the only place to get long-form interviews with global mobility leaders. And wow, am I excited today to have a true industry legend with me, Mike Piker. Welcome to the podcast. Introduce yourself to the community. You'll obviously be familiar to many already, but tell us about a little bit about yourself and a little bit about how you sort of fell into the wonderful world of mobility and now obviously wider reward.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. So I guess fell into it through my dad. So he did it for about 40 years around the world. So I'm kind of second generation GM guy, so to speak. Yes, I'm currently in London, about to relocate to Tokyo with Shiseido. I've been an expat. I think I moved like 35 times, lived in 9 countries. So I guess...
Wow.
And right now I lead reward and do other HR stuff. So mobility reports into me, but basically I earned my chops at ORC, Mercer, and, on the consulting side, and then went in-house. I guess you get with me is somebody that, loves the subject matter, but it's also experienced it personally and lived in so many countries that I have, fairly strong views about the mobility experiences as an assignee, if that makes any sense.
I love that. I mean, where to even start? Firstly, probably the most countries of anyone I've ever met, or certainly the most moves. 35 is insane. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your upcoming one. And secondly, a second generation GM pro. That's incredible. So that, as you know, is pretty unusual. I'm not sure if you've met many other sort of second generation GM professionals, but tell us about when you sort of first became aware that there was even an industry around global mobility then, and because most people sort of fall into it, but it sounds like you maybe had a bit more of a constructed like introduction to the industry.
Yeah, perversely, I guess when I was like 13, 14 years old, my dad was ORC, and we were relocated to London, no less. Lived in Surrey and Cobham, if you know where those.
Yeah.
I learned because ORC, like obviously Eric and ECA, prefer cost of living data. So my father had to explain to the CEO of ORC his own expat packet, and I remember very vividly. Yeah, explaining what a balance sheet approach is to Mr. Beaumont, who's the boss of ORC. And Jeff Latta knew it, but not Mr. Beaumont. And then you arrive, and then you start to realize, okay, so Dad got a COLA, he got housing support. I went to ACS in Cobham. So the company paid for schooling. So when I got a little bit older and I worked for ORC, then I realized it's a fairly lucrative business. I mean, selling cost of living data had a very high margin business, and it was the most expensive assets in the company, and they're very, very demanding assets with lots of complaints. Lots of complaints.
So that was your introduction. I love this as well. ACS, probably, certainly in the UK or in and around the sort of London, one of the most sort of well-known international schools for sure. Yeah. So, what incredible. So, age 13, you're getting introduced to the balance sheet approach to relocations. That's not something that many people have. Okay, so tell us then, 35 relocations, 9 countries. Inevitably, that's going to shape the way that you think about the industry and I imagine the employee experience. What are the sort of like 1 or 2 takeaways that you feel are like most important when relocating to get right from a company perspective?
First, paramount thing's a look-see visit. So I've lived and worked in some really tricky locations like Sao Paulo in Brazil, or like Lausanne, Switzerland. And if your other half is not up for it or into it, that assignment is really tricky. My husband and I had a bit of a tricky time living in Lausanne, Switzerland, which is really quiet. Brazil is got a lot of safety issues. So that was the first thing. The second one is that the policy and the way you move are aligned, meaning right now everything is really super cheap, super fast, tech-enabled, AI-enabled. And global mobility's gone through a massive evolution from traditional to what we call international compensation to expatriate compensation to now talent mobility. That's 35 years I've seen of change. So the second one is that you've got the right talent, the right place, the right time, and the right location. So it's talent-led, not process-led. So that's a very big strategic pivot from moving person A from location A to location B to actually having a purpose why you move.
Yeah, I love that.
If you have those two things, so pre-assignment and purpose, that would be good.
Yeah, well, that would be, well, because definitely on that latter one, if you don't have that purpose there, then it's going to be confusing. Pre-assignment, that I feel is something that has been chipped away at in so many sort of policies.
So many, or not existing at all. People just don't want to.
Not existing at all anymore. So a lot of the people listening to this are leaders potentially who would go in and lobby, and they're maybe lobbying to their boss. So the equivalent of you in places and saying, hey, like, I think this is an important part of the assignment. How would you try to justify the cost and the travel involved in that sort of look-see trip?
Oh, the ROI is fairly straightforward.
Nice.
If the whole complete employee compact is up for it, then the cost and the ROI will be very good. If one half of the equation is very unhappy, not up for it, it's not the right gig for them, it's going to be an unhappy assignment, and you're going to go home fast.
Yeah. Yes, I love that.
And it's happened a couple times in my career.
Yeah, where you see that actually the cost. So you're sort of presenting there. What happens if this fails and they move back after 6, 9, 12 months? And you're like,
they expended them out. It's wasted money down the drain.
I love that. And tell me, Mike, then, so you mentioned then the purpose, and this is going off script, but you mentioned that transition more towards talent mobility. Help us unpack that a little bit. What does that shift actually mean to you towards talent mobility? Like, what are the core bits that make it talent mobility more than sort of traditional global mobility?
Yeah. Great question. So the core precepts are first, and this may be a bit controversial, but forgive me. I like to be
that's what we're here for. I love it.
It would be great if talent mobility reports more and more to the talent and less to the reward team, because I'm the head of reward. I have my peer in talent. 2 is that you have talent types as opposed to duration-based policies. You flip to purpose or talent type policies, and they're actually frameworks but not policies. So you want amorphous flex, but you want a very clear definition, typically of 4 talent types, and underneath that sit the actual policies. Right now, you've got policies that are duration driven, right?
Interesting.
And it's flipping the dime to say, okay, if it's a high potential hypo, then where does that sit on the talent topography?
Yeah.
And where they sit in the talent constellation? That's a very different conversation than I'm moving XYZ individual from, let's say, London to Tokyo.
Yes, and then what needs to happen. So tell us about those talent types then. So you mentioned there's 4.
There's usually 4. So there's typically upper right is like executive. So those are the creme de la creme, highest expenditure. Typically, lower right, you have hypos. So you have emerging or high potential talent that will likely go into the C-suite.
Yeah.
Then you have typically early talents that are B school, been very clearly annotated as have a longitudinal sort of glide paths for talent longevity. And then the fourth one is what I call self-starters. These are Googlers who put on a backpack and they just they take a packet of cash and then they go abroad permanently. And these are self-reliant assignees, DIY assignees, you call them.
Yeah. And I wanted to
the four types.
I love that, and you use the word assignees within that. For you, those four types are covering both like traditional assignments, so you're going somewhere for 2 years or a year or whatever, plus permanent transfers. Everything falls within those four, or you'd say permanent transfers are sort of its own category?
Precisely. Yes. And when I was on the board of ERC, we built GMST. And so the whole curriculum of accreditation was predicated on this sort of mindset shift. But it didn't quite shift as quickly as I would have hoped. So
why do you think that is?
It's still a little bit stuck in the past, policy driven, lots of discussion about getting a seat at the table and ROI. But when you just simply ask commercially led talent questions first, then you have already an elevated voice. If you simply ask, okay, what's the pre-assignment cost estimate from A to B, that's very tactical. When you ask, well, why is that person going, and how are we going to determine the ROI, and what's the longevity of this talent executive? That's a strategic question.
I love that. It's and so often it is so tactical, and it's frustrating when you dive straight into like, well, how much is the household goods shipment going to be, or the look shift, whatever. It's just like, what? It's pretty frustrating. What advice do you have to people listening to this saying, oh yeah, but like all that my teams internally, all that I get asked about is what's it going to cost? That's something we hear a lot. Is GM teams just get asked what's going to cost. What do you do in that situation when it seems like all the business cares about is the cost?
Well, I've been in 8 public companies, really big ones. So typically, when you have this center of expertise in talent mobility, they're the individual that, like Rose at PMI, who's fantastic, or Siobhan, who's a really good friend of mine. These are really high-level strategic thinkers who lead the COE, and then behind them in the operations team does the tactical stuff. So the cost estimate, the reloads, the policy adherence. But you need to have a bifurcation between the COE leader and the operational rhythm of GM. If you try to do both together, it demonizes the leader to not focus on the strategic stuff.
I love that. Such an important point is like, it's so easy to get dragged into the tactical stuff, but as soon as you do that, you are just sort of not digging your own grave, so to speak, but then people are just going to go to you for like any random thing, or they're going to say like, hey, this exec's relocating, help out, etc. And then you lose that ability to just step above. Super interesting. I love those for talent types. Changing gears slightly, Mike, you've moved 30 plus times. You're just about to launch in again with another move to Japan. Why are you going again? Tell everyone why you're sort of gearing up for number 35 or whatever it is.
Good question. So kind of like what I alluded to earlier, when I was 13 in Cobham, I guess when I was really young, and by the way, that early stint, I had to learn to acclimate to the UK. That was my first cultural moray. Which was not so easy. Well, when you do it so frequently, like I have, I'm going to Tokyo because it's another enjoyable experience. I love it. I love Japan. I love the language. I love the brand Shiseido I'm about to work for. But I like the sheer excitement of plunking down in a new place, relearning the language, being in a very, cultural immersion in Japan is really tricky. It's what I call culture on steroids. This is Singapore's an easy assignment where I was there. Japan is a hard assignment.
Yeah.
But the harder assignment teach you to be a better human being and be more humble. And being a gaijin in Japan is something I really enjoyed in some perverse way.
Nice. Did you? Because the classically people would say it is a tough assignment and difficult to integrate into local communities there. How did you? Or did you find ways to overcome that your first time around?
Yeah. Well, this is my fourth time. So I was a student in Osaka. Then I was teaching on the JET program. When I worked at Yokogawa RC, which was a JV, you learn how to sell to Japanese companies and how they send assignees overseas. How you sell in Japan is a very long process. Very social, very title-based, lots of meetings before the real meeting. And if you don't do that, then you don't get the business. And little things like cleaning the office on Fridays. You never would do that with all my colleagues. To giving gifts to clients. It's a very gift-based culture, right? You have to go out and socialize and drink with clients because that's the way business is conducted. So it's very different than some other countries I lived in.
I love that. And it's so it's you're touching on all my trigger points here, Mike. You're touching about being strategic in the mobility world, which is so important. And then on the relocator side, just how fun it is to get stuck in and learn to adapt. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Mike. This is off script, but what's your view on cultural training? I feel like
cultural training is important. Particularly for folks that have never lived actually overseas, or it's their first stint, or for, again, culturally, like Brazil was tricky, Japan tricky, China. I've lived in some really culturally tough. If you don't know what you're about to walk into, it can make it really, really tough for you. So there, it's really important. And if you never lived there or speak the language, you can sail or die quickly. Same in China. So I gradate this based on the cultural intensity, where you see more attempt to integrate and how hard it's going to be. You really need it. I love that. That is actually an area where, and actually takes me back to your comment on frameworks versus policies. Tell us. I think that is quite like in vogue at the moment to not have like a 60-page policy with like every edge case in there. But what do you mean by a framework? And if someone was to ask, but what about if they ask, I don't know, what do we do about this expense or whatever? So, some very detailed question. What are frameworks and what are their benefits versus policies? So policy connotes sort of like policy police, and you're the adjudicator of yes or no question, which is not a very fun role to promulgate, as opposed to frameworks where sit underneath talent and they're more malleable and they're more porous, i.e. You've got a price point of, let's say, upper right CEO, and within that construct, it's more than core and flex, which is talked about ad infinitum. This is more about malleability of, okay, can we send the pet, but we're not going to do this. And it's basically an ethos of, we're generally going to give you this, and we're gonna be flexible to some extent.
Is it?
A policy is very strict, 60 pages, like you said. I've written it probably 100 million times. And people, they read it, and if it's already 60 pages, they put it on the table and they don't even read it. They don't read it. They don't read it.
It's they don't read it. In some ways, actually, like they can generate more questions than fewer, because it's like, A, they don't read it, B, if they do, they're like, oh, this weird thing that's written doesn't quite apply to my situation, so can I like have an exception or whatever? And actually, some of the most granular policies have the most exceptions at times, which is a weird sort of thing to think about. But actually having
this
a
is
little bit.
something I'm gonna look at Shiseido, but recently in Flutter, I mean, Rachel set up fantastic sort of core, and then here was a price point. You can avail of that pot of money however you wish, and then we don't play the policeman game. And when I moved from Switzerland to the UK with Flutter, it works very well, actually.
Nice. Yeah, well, and I think that's it. It's not playing the policeman is such a nice way of putting it, and leads me on to my next very sort of off-agenda piece, but we've sort of had 20 minutes of conversation, a few conversations over the last year or so. You're so strategic in the way you think about mobility, which we discussed is not always super common in the space. And you've obviously done an amazing job of breaking out to big reward positions for global mobility leaders who are looking to take that next jump, either to a wider talent role or a wider reward role. What advice do you have? Because it seems to be an area that our industry struggles with a little bit, is sometimes breaking into those bigger roles.
Great question. I faced that conundrum 8 years after I worked at ORC, and then I wanted to broaden because I felt that talent mobility was a bit narrow. Yeah. And I wanted to go, it was two things. I wanted to go in-house to actually implement, and I wanted to be broader. Yeah. So typically GM reports either into talent or into total reward, people like me. Yeah. And so if you've got a good boss or a good manager, they can actually enrich your quiver with broader responsibility. Yeah. And seek it out vociferously. So constantly, ask your manager, I want to do something beyond GM. So there's adjacencies, like in exec comp benefits you could do. But GM is so technical with immigration, tax, employment law, permanent establishment, Of all my direct reports, it's the trickiest technical job because it covers a swath of issues. And if you can do that, then you're pretty apt to then do other tricky roles, which are probably not as tricky because you've already done the trickiest one. Yeah. And think about it this way. Expats are one of the highest costs per FTE, just like exec comp. And so I'm responsible for both. So if you know what it costs to full cost load to send somebody to country, that's perfect segue into other areas of reward or to eventually get my job. Yeah. So I like to move people around within my team or move them into the talent and report into that function. Yeah. That would be great. Yeah. So it's trying to really synchronize with your manager and say, I actually want to do something more than just GM and actually lead the conversation. And a good manager would be receptive to saying, okay, prove to me your ability in the role, and I'm going to do something in a couple of years for you to do something else.
I love that. And I think something that
a lot of my GM leaders, Rachel at Flutter moved into HR ops. I can get numerous examples of people who work for me who've done other areas.
100%.
GM is a great area, but it is only a certain set of assignees that were at a very high price point. Yeah, exactly. It's only 3 to 5% typically of a company's workforce, where reward actually covers 100% of the workforce.
100%, and that's, I think, is particularly for ambitious people, they want to have that impact on everyone. And I really love because I feel sometimes people do themselves down and say, I've got all this technical knowledge, but that's just not relevant to other bits of reward or talent or whatever. But actually, as you say, it's like this stuff is freaking hard. No. So if you've managed to
it's freaking
master
hard. I mean, just like mastering employment law and immigration and getting a work permit, it's really hard work, right? And tax equalization. And if you can do that, you can handle then exec comp, who are same price point, super expensive. Yeah. And they complain a lot and they're highly visible. So
I think that was the other one I was going to mention. You're used to dealing with tricky customers, like assignees, relocators, there's a lot of spend there, and there's a lot of stress there, which I actually think teaches people how to handle some of these.
Like expats.
Exactly.
Very similar.
Yeah, which as you go into sort of bigger roles, you'll actually be well equipped because you're so used to dealing with stressful situations. And it's I think piggybacking onto your manager.
GM handles probably from a vendor management ecosystem the most largest diaspora from RMCs, AMAT to a Big Four to Frogman. I mean, I could go through the list. The supplier ecosystem for GM is so complex and vast. If you could do that, insane. You could absolutely slam dunk another role in HR. There's no question. I
actually was, because I was catching up with a sort of a client recently who transitioned from an HR ops role into mobility and was like, God, it's so crazy. Now I'm like managing 8 different vendors. I'm dealing with like difficult employee situations and stuff. It's like, it seems like it's so vast, it's like so big, this stuff. And it's, I think because it is, as you say, not always 100% of the population, people can sometimes like not have the confidence to really step up. But actually the skills you learn in this space are so applicable to sort of wider.
They're so applicable.
Wider roles. And the one question I did want to ask, you mentioned 3 to 5%. That's often the classic sort of percentage of expats involved. Yep. For more like high growth tech companies, that percent is often 10, 20%. Sometimes once you've fold in the
Cisco, Lenovo I worked at, it was 8 to 10%. Classic FMCG banks at 3 to 5.
Exactly.
And the other thing, data point, as you know, is permanent. So you serve traditional, so it's difficult to get a data point on permanent transfers.
It's really difficult to get a data point, and I think, as you say, as it shifts slightly away from reward, more into talent, then you see those terms, but they're much less consistent than the expat populations. But that is, I think, a good way to increase your strategic involvement in the companies. If you can go, hey, let's, on top of the expats, really start bringing on board early careers into the world of mobility, like new hires, etc., just so that you go from 3 to 5% to 10% potentially, or 15% even at times, and then you're helping more people.
And the other thing is, good companies put a central pot for talent investment as opposed to recharging it out to all the host locations.
Exactly.
So the more foresightful, talent-led organizations say, you know what, we're going to hold that pot in the center at HQ, and we're going to dip into the pot as and when need arises, because otherwise the host locations are not going to bear the cost.
Mike, that is an absolute trigger for me. Central versus recharging everything. How do you make that argument? How do you make that argument? So many people are going to say, I'd love to have a central budget. It's great. It benefits the entire organization. How do you make that argument for a central pot to dip into? Question one. And then I'll have many more on this.
No, it's a very apt. So if you're a talent-led organization at your core DNA, right? If that's the culture and the ethos of why you exist as an enterprise, then it falls off the back of that commercial ambition. I invest in talent, and then a subset of that is talent mobility central pot. Because of the talent types, 3 to 5% or whatever it might be is expats. And then you have hypos who are locals. But that investment is typically done in a central, and big companies like Unilever, BP, PMI I worked at, centrally focus on talent investment as a strategic weapon.
And it completely aligned. If you are talent, so many companies say, talent is their biggest advantage. We only recruit the best, etc. And then are like not necessarily willing to centrally support that, which is always interesting. Do you advocate for trying to get all of the costs centrally through central HQ? Do you sort of say some of the costs, but maybe some bits are borne by, are recharged out? I've seen it where actually, maybe like some central costs are are always like maybe core is born centrally, and then like the allowances are born by the local teams and recharged out. Where do you sort of, well, let's get really specific here. What would you lobby for?
Yeah, typically if you have the base salary, STI and LTI, the base employment cost that sits wherever it arises from, keep that intact, because that hits your SG&A costs regardless.
Yeah.
It's all the overbase. So COLA, housing, education, tax equalization, pre-assignment, what I call the overbase costs, central pot only. If you can just grab that for 3 to 5%, and then you can amortize what the typical per overbase cost is per FTE, and then build your pot.
Yes.
Rather than have the fully loaded cost, because typically it's a tough argument to wean somebody off, put it in a central pot, and when they go back to their home country, who's going to bear the cost again?
Exactly. And I think that model works well as saying, because people again always say, well, how much should it be? Should it be like how do we try and figure out? But you have to just put some stakes in the ground. If you have historical data and it's always 4%, put it at 4%. If you know it's going to,
you're trailing spend average per FT overbase cost, and you can draw a figure through the middle, and then multiply by that how many talent types you wish to create.
Yeah, and it's because it's nothing, I think, causes more angst than everything being borne by the local like department or country, and then them just saying, I don't want to spend so much. It puts mobility in a hopeless position, and it really it just doesn't create a good situation where you've had leadership say, hey, we want talent to be mobile, we want to grow internationally. I'm always amazed at how many sort of public companies, one of their top 3 goals is international growth, and often that's going to be accompanied with like relocation.
100%,
there's often not centrally budget put, because it's like, it's variable, like why should we bear it? Makes such difference.
And if you're a small emerging that's going international, like you're a good example, you're going from centralized to maybe hybrid and eventually global. Whatever way organization you organize yourself, like I've been in companies that have been federated, completely decentralized, hybrid, or very centralized. And whatever way you run the organization reflects how you fund talent. And the biggest inflection point is when you're going from international to a global company. Global companies truly invest in their talent as one holistic strategic view. And not all companies do that. That's probably only about 10% of 10% of public companies around the world. It's not many. Not many.
Well,
and I work for many of them.
And I'm always surprised when we're speaking with massive household names, and they're like, everything's still super decentralized, and sort of each local office does their own thing. It's like you'd be shocked,
tricky.
But when you make that transition, it does make a world of difference to make it work. We've come a long way from age 13, going through your balance sheet approach for your dad when you moved to Cobham, through to talent mobility today. Let's talk looking forwards. I know you're very much involved in the sort of utilization of AI, and both in reward generally, but also in mobility. Going to get really specific here. What impact do you think that's going to have on mobility, and actually in particular on the role of RMCs in the industry?
Probably 3. I'm usually at the 3 by 3. So
I like it. You're a true consultant, Mike.
Exactly. So chatbots are probably going to disintermediate your basic queries. So if you think about, let's say, a signee going like me to Tokyo, if I have a really good GPT-40 now, it's not just GPT-4, I can find out a lot about what it takes to get me to Tokyo and be successful. So then the question is, to what extent do I need destination service and an RMC, right? 2 is, I can actually start to modulate what the cost, if I self-prescribe what I desire for to survive there. I can be more informed on what costs I need to survive and then negotiate with the company from an informed position, as opposed to the company telling me what they think they want to pay me. That's a big difference with AI. 3 is that the whole, if you think of AMS, so assignment management solutions, so the top 3 or 4, I won't mention their names. They're going to have to wiggle through this AI tsunami of DIY. It's going to become more prevalent. Digital wallet, which is already coming into vogue. But more importantly is the AI is going to automate through video, audio, third-gen AI. It's going to allow individuals to actually create their own assignment themselves. How they are paid, create their own letter, create the assignment destination service support at their desktop. And then what does an AMS and RMC do differently that's a value add? When the assignee is so well informed about how to get there, what's the secret sauce that's on top of what the assignee already knows? And that's coming. So like I'm involved with Atlas Copilot. Josh Burson has a new chatbot for HR. These chatbots now, you could look up anything in the mobility space, write your policy, write your framework, cost your assignment, find your mover yourself, and go.
100%. 100%. And it's actually, and that's like right now, and we're sort of looking at purpose building some of these things. But if you think about how much the initial purpose was, Mike, you're moving to Tokyo. You don't know who the banks are there. You don't know how to find a house there. You don't know. So it's like, oh my God, obviously there's utility in this supply chain around the world. Now it's at the and like how do you set up the assignment letter? Now all of that stuff had been changing anyway since the internet era. The like instantaneousness of it had been just becoming more and more prevalent, and now it is actually that core function is becoming less and less valuable because it's all there instantaneously. So really, I think user experience to some extent, stitching it together in a sensible way. But so much of the legacy technology is not necessarily, and legacy models are going to be challenged, I think, in that space. But it's exciting overall because I think it could really help lower some of the costs of relocation in general, which should allow for more relocations to happen midterm.
The buyer ship, so less expenditure, but more assignee overall. Absolutely.
Exactly, which is, ultimately, I think, and I know you're an advocate of this, it's amazing when people move around the world, integrate cultures, etc. So it's if we can have more of that, it's ultimately, and I think, good for our industry as well to, if we can go from helping 3 to 5% of employees to helping 10% more consistently, that just helps increase the exposure.
Absolutely. A more interconnected world overall.
Exactly, 100%. So AI is going to really change the business money, the business models. I wanted to dig into that second one, which was around sort of self-ascribing, finding everything out themselves. I think that's something that has already happened to some extent, where people are like, "Oh, I found this thing, and I want to like use my own mover or whatever it is." That's already happening to some extent. What advice do you think? Just lean into that and give employees complete freedom? Do you think? What's your view? Do you are you really advocating for like just giving the employee as much flexibility as possible?
Yeah, again, predicated back to talent type. So if it's DIY, I totally lean into that. Find your mover, find your language, find your cultural support, pre-assignment yourself. I'll give you a pot of cash, go. For the senior exec, a bit tricky for the reasons we know. The question mark is in between. So the hypos and the early talents.
Yes.
Would you lean in? Yeah, I would say to some extent. It's more than core and flex. It's about malleability and frameworks again versus policy. So if you really need them to go strategically, the framework's not going to get in the way of them going.
Yeah.
So it's about commercial ambition and intent. And I guess what I'm saying is lean in, definitely DIY. Execs, probably not. Somewhere in between.
Yeah.
To some extent. That's
to some extent.
Kind of where I would land on that.
Yeah. And this is a very tactical question, but in that world of frameworks, I think something we hear leaders sort of struggle through sometimes is, in that slightly flexible world, are you sort of trying to cap the cost of that framework and saying, hey, like, you have flexibility up to like 30K of spend or 60K of spend or whatever, because otherwise if you give people flexibility and someone has like a massive house that they need to ship or whatever, that can be really expensive. How do you think about that cost piece in a world with flexibility?
I would say a capping typically with DIY, no brainer. There's definitely a cost cap and early emerging talent cost cap. But I would say for hypo and exec, you got to be malleable. So you can't be stringent and police-like. And the exception requests come infinitum for somebody of that level and seniority. So I would sweat your attention on the other talent types and less so on the other, the more strategic ones.
I love that. And it's
very pragmatic of where you spend your time.
Be pragmatic, spend your time, and also just don't bother being so restrictive with the exec policies. It's like, even if you get very prescriptive, there are all going to be exceptions anyway. Like these folk, they know like how businesses work.
And the RMCs will charge you for exception management.
Yeah, exactly. You're just literally just pouring money and time and sort of it's sort of then it's such a sort of it's a fool's errand. It like makes sense, nice, it's get things set up, but it doesn't work. Mike, we're going way too long here, but let's keep pressing on. You mentioned one of the great traditions we have, Mike, is the previous guest leaving a question. For you, we have a very apt question for you, which I think for a man with your experience of living around the world, the question is, if you could go on assignment anywhere in the world, where would you go? You're going back to Japan, so I don't know if that is your answer, but if you truly had, like,
it is,
you could go anywhere in the world for assignment. It is nice.
Yeah, it was. I had a couple opportunities. This one arose very quickly. Yeah, and I'm more towards the sort of tail end of my career, and I wanted to go back again and experience it. So, it was just the right role with the right brand in the right country. Yeah. So all the stars aligned. It was beautiful.
It's not often that those things happen, and I'm very jealous. I have to plan a trip out to Tokyo to see you, because it's when I was at Amazon, it was frequently somewhere that I was like, okay, let's look at roles there and see if I can get myself there. Now, but running an RMC, I feel it's sadly probably not the best stage of my life to go live in Japan, but we'll get some business trips there for sure. But you never know. And it's certainly it's a country that is becoming more open to immigration and for the population needs. So it's such a beautiful place. I'm so excited to hear how you get on there. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your wisdom today, Mike. It's honestly so nice to have such a strategic conversation and get your pearls of wisdom coming through. So thanks for coming on the show, and speak to you very soon.
Hey, Dee, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Cheers, Mike.
Great to see you, man. Thanks. Cheers.